No one expected that in the heart of the Saskatchewan prairie, where it seems like there's nothing but wind and snow, there lies a mineral that could reshape the global balance of power. It doesn't glow like oil, doesn't smell like gas, and doesn't make headlines like uranium. It simply lies silently, deep beneath layers of sedimentary rock nearly 1,000 meters underground. But that very silence is its strength, because no one can grow anything without it. Without potash, there are no crops, no food, and no social stability. Canada calls it pink gold, not for its beauty, but for its growing strategic value in a world rocked by political upheaval. On the surface, potash mines look like plain industrial zones, but beneath every ton of mineral pulled from the earth is a ticket to power. And the scariest thing for any superpower is when its lifeline lies beyond its borders, in the hands of another nation, especially one that's been wounded by its own actions. For the United States, Canadian potash is the lifeblood of an agricultural industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars a year. From corn in Iowa to soybeans in Kansas and cotton in Texas, everything depends on something seemingly invisible: nutrients for the soil. For farmers, potash isn't strategy, it's survival. But for those in power, especially Donald Trump, potash might just be a number on an import chart. And that's where a strategic misstep begins. When Trump threatened to slap a 35% tariff on Canadian goods, he might have thought he was flexing, trying to bring jobs back to America, protect the steel industry, or simply score political points before an election. But he may have forgotten one crucial fact. In a post-pandemic world where global supply chains are fragile and markets can be shaken by a single tweet, nothing is small. Canada didn't shout. It didn't react in haste. But deep inside the halls of Ottawa, a thought may have quietly started to take shape. If the US treats trade like a battlefield, then Canada has every right to choose its weapon. And in that silent arsenal, potash is emerging as a trump card, not loud, but immensely powerful. Because if Washington chooses to impose, Saskatchewan can choose to delay. If Trump raises tariff walls, Canada can just as easily rebuild its own export barriers. No need for sanctions, no threats required, just a simple notice of scheduled maintenance at a key potash mine. That alone would be enough to rattle America's agricultural market. And right at that moment, when Canadians were still debating whether to stay patient or strike back, south of the border, a unilateral decision was made. No press conference, no warning, just a tweet from Donald Trump's account, brief, defiant, like a spark tossed into the powder keg of North America. No one expected that a single tweet could ignite a geopolitical earthquake. But that's the Donald Trump way. No long speeches, just one tap of the keyboard, and the entire North American region is thrown into turmoil. On July 25th, he posted the message, "If Canada doesn't respect America, we will impose tariffs. 35% on everything. Simple. No more, no less, no evidence, no exceptions." Immediately, the financial markets roared. The Canadian dollar slipped. The Toronto Stock Exchange bled red. Export giants began to stumble. But the real shockwave didn't hit trading floors. It hit the halls of power in Ottawa. Because for the first time in years, a close ally was being treated like a trade adversary. No negotiation table, no prior warning, just imposition. Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister of Canada, a former central bank governor and a renowned economist, understood clearly. This wasn't just a tariff war. It was a declaration of war on the open trade model Canada had spent decades building. But how to respond, that was the hard part. Carney knew that reacting too strongly could hurt Canadians, especially the industries that depend on exports. But failing to respond would brand him as weak. A new leader in his first months in office was being tested not just economically, but in terms of strategic resolve. Inside closed-door sessions of Parliament, the debate grew heated. Conservative MPs asked, "Why are we always the ones holding back?" Farmers voiced anger over fears of losing the US market. Logistics firms cried out as contracts were stalled. Then a question rose, not from a general or strategist, but from a representative from Saskatchewan, home to some of the world's largest potash mines. Why aren't we using potash? At first, it sounded absurd amid talk of steel tariffs, lumber tariffs, and digital taxes. But the deeper they looked, the more it made sense. Potash, that pink-hued mineral, was something America had no quick substitute for. Not cars, not software, but soil. Soil and what feeds it. If Canada restricted the potash supply, the US would lose access to a critical flow of fertilizer. And when agriculture falters, it's not just about food, it's about the entire political system behind it. Donald Trump once declared himself the president of America's farmers. But the very tariff strike he delivered to Canada now risked becoming a boomerang, not just cutting supply chains, but severing the trust of his most loyal voters. And there, in the heavy silence of US government meetings, a new fact started taking shape: that American agriculture, long seen as invincible, was hiding a fatal vulnerability, a deep dependency on a single foreign partner, a fragile link in a massive food chain. Not everyone knows what potash is, but to the hands that till the soil, they know. Miss a week of fertilizing, and you could lose an entire season. And if Canada decided to maintain the mines right at planting time, then Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, the states that once lit the electoral map red, would tremble. Not because of politics, but because of land, because of fields, because the barley and corn would thirst for that invisible nutrient. That's when Americans were forced to look inward. A vast, high-tech agricultural system, and yet it runs on a mineral imported from another country. And the most troubling part isn't that potash is under threat, but that the United States, with all its power and potential, still has no backup plan for fertilizer. No one ever imagined that a powerhouse like American agriculture could be threatened by a mineral. But that's the paradox of the 21st century. The more powerful and sophisticated a system becomes, the more unexpected its weak points. For the United States, potash, potassium fertilizer, isn't just a soil supplement. It's a critical link in a food production chain worth hundreds of billions of dollars each year. And the danger lies in this simple fact: America doesn't control its own supply. The numbers don't lie. Of the more than 5 million tons of potash the US consumes annually, less than 10% is produced domestically. The rest, almost all of it, comes from Canada, more specifically from deep beneath the ground in Saskatchewan. There, massive underground tunnels stretch for kilometers through ancient geological layers, where miners operate colossal machines in the dark, lifting ton after ton of pink gold to serve faraway farms thousands of miles to the south. And the irony? The very farmers in Iowa, Kansas, and Texas, the same ones who proudly wave Trump banners, are almost entirely dependent on trade policy with Canada. They may not know exactly what potash is. They just know that without it, crops don't grow, yields drop, and their families' livelihoods are at risk. Because farmland doesn't wait for trade negotiations to conclude. Soil doesn't understand tariffs. And crops don't wait for the next tweet. In grocery stores, most consumers don't yet feel the weight of this dependency. But in the offices of agribusiness giants, state agriculture boards, and especially in campaign war rooms, that fear has already crept into every briefing note. Because if Canada decides to halt exports, even temporarily, even for just a few weeks, the entire US fertilizer supply chain would grind to a halt. Not because America can't find alternatives, but because there wouldn't be enough time to adapt before planting season hits. That fear turned real when a few agricultural firms began receiving notifications. Canadian shipments were now being reevaluated due to policy risk factors. Harmless sounding words on paper, yet they carried massive weight, like a gray cloud slowly descending over the golden fields of America's Midwest. The bitterest truth of all, the US has no backup plan. There's no strategic potash reserve, no emergency trade pact with an alternate supplier, not even a long-term roadmap for restoring domestic production, because for years, dependence on Canada was seen as safe, even natural. And when the most powerful nation on earth finds itself waiting on shipments from another country just to plant its crops, there's no need for further warnings about strategic imbalance. Because if they once said he who controls oil controls the world, then now, at a quieter but no less vital level, another truth is emerging. He who controls fertilizer holds soft power over even the widest fields. But while the United States scrambles to find a response, across the border, Canada is no longer silent. There's no loud press conference, no ultimatums, just a precise, quiet counterstrike, subtle but devastatingly effective. A shift is underway, not through words, but through freight trains rerouted, low-profile deals inked in Asia, and quiet decisions that are beginning to shake the foundations of America's agricultural dominance. While Washington was still tangled in debate, retaliate or negotiate, Ottawa had already moved quietly and decisively. No grand declarations, no angry outbursts, no threats, just closed-door meetings, international calls, and silent budget approvals. Canada understood that in this new power struggle, the winner isn't the one who shouts the loudest, it's the one who prepares thoroughly and strikes at the right moment. In Saskatchewan, the country's potash capital, operations were ramping up to unprecedented levels. A fertilizer recovery fund was created, a strategic insurance shield for the entire industry. Hundreds of millions of dollars were funneled into expanding reserves, upgrading logistics infrastructure, and modernizing railway lines to transport potash without needing to pass through U.S. territory. New freight trains were ordered, port transfer hubs in Vancouver were upgraded, and most notably, bilateral agreements began to take shape, quietly but clearly enough for the world to see that Canada was no longer standing alone. India was the first to jump in. With a population of over 1.4 billion and a massive demand for fertilizer, New Delhi signed an immediate deal to import over 2 million tons of Canadian potash annually, complete with transport incentives and long-term stability guarantees. China wasn't far behind. With its supply chains from Belarus and Russia disrupted by sanctions, Beijing quietly reopened diplomatic channels with Ottawa. The result, a priority deal signed under the label of agricultural risk hedging trade. Japan, ever forward-thinking, dispatched a special envoy to Vancouver and swiftly signed a memorandum of understanding with Canada's Ministry of Agriculture. Even Europe, once heavily reliant on Russian supply, turned to Canada, seeking a stable and ethically safe source. Each of these agreements was like a small cut, enough to start bleeding the global fertilizer market. Because once Canada stopped viewing the US as its priority partner, the flow of potash began to shift, not southward, but outward to the east and west, where buyers were willing to pay more, offer stability, and most importantly, avoid coercion. For the Trump administration, this wasn't just an economic blow, it was a strike to its image of leadership. A superpower being quietly sidelined by its allies, not because it was weak, but because it was no longer trusted. A new world was taking shape, where power didn't just rest in weapons or technology, but in the land, and what nourishes that land. And from this quiet repositioning, a domino effect began to unfold. Because fertilizer, once seen as a domestic dispute between the US and Canada, was, in truth, the foundation of the global food system. When one link shakes, the entire supply chain stumbles. And the consequences would reach far beyond the farms of North America, to the dinner tables of Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, where a bag of rice or a loaf of bread can mean survival day by day. Potash is not oil. You can't store it by the millions of barrels in underground reserves waiting for the right moment. You can't replace it with renewables or green carbon innovations. Potash is a mineral of timing, of planting rhythms, of soil cycles and seed lifespans. A slight delay in supply, just a few weeks, can throw an entire growing season into disarray. And when one season fails, it's not just one farmer's problem, it quietly ripples through every link in the global food chain. In Iowa, a farmer looks to the sky, counting the days left before he has to plant soybeans. If the fertilizer doesn't arrive in time, he'll have to choose. Plant early in nutrient-poor soil and accept lower yields, or wait and gamble with the fickle spring weather. Either way, it's a roll of the dice. And with every toss, the cost of an average American meal is quietly placed on the table too. In Africa, fertilizer importers have already seen prices jump by 50% compared to the previous quarter. Shipments from Belarus are delayed, Russian sources are restricted by sanctions, and now Canada, the most stable supplier, is shifting its priority toward Asia and strategic partners. That means a container of potash is no longer bound directly from Mombasa or Lagos. Instead, it now queues behind Tokyo, New Delhi, and Hamburg. Wait times grow longer, logistics costs climb, and in the end, the poor pay more for meals they already struggle to afford. Global corn prices are inching upward. Wheat futures in Chicago are swinging wildly. Rice prices in Asia are feeling the squeeze too, because even in regions that don't use potash directly, the ripple effect hits via livestock feed costs, palm oil prices, and intermediate goods. It's all connected by one fragile thread the world had nearly forgotten: fertilizer. And now the world is waking up to a truth long overlooked amid the chaos of a new geopolitical era. The food front is very real. There are no bombs dropping, no tanks crossing borders, no grand slogans, just soil, drier, weaker, undernourished. Just seeds, smaller, slower to grow. But this is how modern warfare unfolds, not through firepower, but through famine. Canada understands this power. They don't need to threaten a supply cut. All they need is to let the market believe it could happen, and that's enough. A leaked report on scheduled maintenance at a Saskatchewan mine. A draft bill on export controls based on geopolitical risk assessments. A vague comment from a government advisor hinting that supply priorities will be based on long-term stability commitments. That's all it takes for prices to swing, for nations to start stockpiling, for companies to redirect investments, for governments to quietly reshuffle food subsidy budgets. A world that once prided itself on AI-driven agriculture, satellite monitoring, and blockchain-enhanced supply chains now finds itself trembling over a raw mineral hauled by hand from hundreds of meters below ground. In this undeclared war, whoever controls fertilizer holds the power to negotiate at the dinner tables of billions. And if the US continues to underestimate the importance of potash, if it keeps slapping tariffs on the only country that can supply this essential resource, then sooner or later, those golden fields will turn gray. Not from drought, but from the absence of tiny, quiet, essential minerals slipping out of their grasp. In a world where all the spotlight seems to shine on high tech, on semiconductors, lithium batteries, and artificial intelligence, it's hard to believe that a raw, dull, silent mineral could become a strategic weapon powerful enough to make a superpower tread carefully. But that's exactly what proves this. The world is entering an era where power no longer lies in who has the most weapons, but in who controls what sustains human life, buried deep in the ground. Potash isn't a modern invention. It's been resting underground in Saskatchewan for millions of years, uncelebrated by the media, unrecognized by global expose. But as supply chains become fragile, trust between nations weakens, and food shifts from a consumer product to a strategic asset, potash suddenly rises as a new symbol of soft power. Canada doesn't need to posture, it only needs to hold steady. There's no need to challenge the US with bold words. All it has to do is show the world that it can choose its partners, and that no one has the right to impose terms without offering equal respect. In the way Canada redirects exports, strengthens reserves, diversifies markets, and quietly signs deals with India, China, and Japan, what you see isn't showmanship, but the quiet confidence of a country that understands its own value. And that is the most enduring kind of strength. While Washington argues over tariffs, while America's farming states scramble in uncertainty, a new strategy is quietly taking shape in Ottawa. Not one of declarations, but of action. No sanctions, no blockades, just one simple truth. If you don't respect the supply will no longer prioritize you. If you treat the land with disregard, the land will stop blooming for you. What's striking is that it's not just America's rivals, but its closest allies like Japan, Germany, and Mexico, who are now approaching Canada, not with accusations, but with requests to become strategic fertilizer partners. That says something profound. In this post-globalization era, power doesn't come from who you can coerce, but from who still wants to stay by your side. Donald Trump may believe that tariffs will force Canada to yield, but reality is proving the opposite. No loud protests, no cries for help, just the steady hum of mining deeper, staying on rhythm, and waiting for others to come knocking. And from this, a powerful lesson is beginning to surface. Not just for the US, but for every country that depends on global supply chains. The world no longer operates by the logic of the 1990s. This is an age of fragmentation, of a global order being reshaped by things that once seemed trivial: a chip, a battery, a bag of fertilizer. And if there's one thing worth reflecting on, it's this. Does power in the 21st century still lie in weapons and capital, or has it moved closer to home, to the soil, the water, and the humble granules that feed our entire planet? If you've made it this far and you feel this is a story worth thinking about, if you sense that the wars of the future may not fire a single bullet but still shake the world, leave a comment below. What do you think about the role of raw resources in modern geopolitical conflicts? And more importantly, are you ready to see the world through a new lens, where land and food are no longer just ordinary, Subscribe to the channel to join us on a journey into the silent weapons reshaping the global order. Because in today's world, power no longer lives in the loudest places. It hides where few are looking. And you, who stayed until the end of this video, now hold something more valuable than anything else.